checking on which is our good side. Thank you all for coming. So,
You want to start?
I would love for you to start.
Well, I would like to say, first of all, how very grateful I am for your kind hospitality in Kitsap. And if it's Thursday, this must be Bainbridge Island. This is the third of 3 sessions that I've had the privilege of doing, and I've been very impressed with the quality of the conversation we've had in the previous 2 sessions. So looking forward very much, and hopefully we'll have a little limited time for formal comments so that we can start opening it up very quickly. And I also want to say what a privilege it is to work with Sue, who's one of our star graduate students from the program at Michigan State University, where I taught for many years. And very impressed with her and her work, even in the early days before she's done some of her more recent things. So what I would like to do by way of just getting us started with some issues is there's a ton of, as well characterized, I think, in the afterword of the book, there's a ton of significant ethical issues in this book about Henrietta Lacks and about today's status of the issue that I think could be called biobanking, which has to do with ownership and rights in tissues that are taken from a person's body. So it's a little different from experimentation on your body. Now, if we look historically at what happened in 1951 when Henrietta was at Johns Hopkins getting treated, unfortunately with no success, for her cervical cancer, and today there's been huge changes in terms of people's rights to be informed and pretty significant requirements with regard to informed consent and review of research by groups such as the Institutional Review Board that Sue serves on. But they were not, I don't think, as far advanced in the area of biobanking, and it's not clear that things are as different. It would certainly be the case, as we've talked about at the other sites, that if something was taken from your body, probably you would sign a form. And the form would say that you're giving up rights to this, except that if you didn't want it to be used for research, you could probably say no. You could not use this for research. But if you sat down and said to anybody, what do you mean research? There's virtually no likelihood that anybody could meaningfully sit down and tell you what that meant, to know what you were signing. And it's quite possible that whatever research means today would be quite different 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. So even though it's very likely, as we talked about at the earlier sessions, that whatever was taken from you would probably just get destroyed once it was no longer of use to your therapy, in the unusual circumstance that it was preserved, 10, 15, 20 years from now, somebody could come up with a new scientific use for that material, and you might have no way of being informed or being aware that your cells were, or your tissues were being used in that way. So in many ways, things have not changed since the 1950s when these events occurred. I would like to call attention, just to start the discussion, to another area in which I think that things may not have changed as much as we think they've changed. A book that I became aware of very recently, just about the time that I was rereading the Rebecca Skloot book to get ready for these sessions, I then became aware of this new book called Black and Blue by John Hoberman from University of Texas in Austin. And Hoberman's book, I believe it's just subtitled The Origins and Consequences of Medical Racism. And Hoberman's book, I think, poses a very serious challenge to people like me who work in academic medicine, where we teach medical students and do research in medicine. Hoberman points out that for 20 years now we've been doing research on what gets called health disparities. Health disparities, if we just for now talk about African Americans as our group of interest. Health disparities is basically research about, do African Americans get less access to health care compared to whites? And if they get health care, are their outcomes as good as what whites experience? And the research has been done over and over and over again in many different diseases, many different parts of the country. And the answer is almost always there's a significant difference between blacks and whites, both in access to health care and in terms of outcomes. And then at the end of the studies that were done 20 years ago, they said, we don't know why this is, so obviously we need more research. And what Hoberman points out is, if you look at the studies done last week and compare the studies done last week to 20 years ago, even though thousands of these studies have been done, the ones last week say, we don't know why this is and we need more research. And he says, what's going on? There's something funny going on here. And he has a hypothesis, and he offers it as a hypothesis. His hypothesis is that, as I understand it, is that all through the 19th and the good part of the 20th century, there existed in white American society a folklore about black bodies. That we were sure, we white people were sure, and doctors were as sure as anybody else, and doctors wrote articles about this for medical journals, that black bodies were substantially different from whites, usually in an inferior way, and that black bodies were less evolved and more primitive than white bodies. And that a doctor taking care of patients needed to know these differences if you were going to treat white patients and black patients. Now, the medical profession, which likes to think of itself as being reasonably liberal and scientifically informed, and of course none of those beliefs were in any way based on what today we would recognize as good science. I call it folklore because that's what it was not science. But it was published in scientific journals as fact. Okay? Liberal white medicine would like to imagine that with the civil rights movement of the 1970s and 60s, we forgot all that. And none of that folklore bothers us today. It's all been gotten rid of. It's all historical artifact. Hoberman says, is that really how society works? Is that really how culture works? Can we get rid of these deeply rooted beliefs so quickly? So his hypothesis is at least part of the reasons for health disparities persisting today is that at some level that folklore about black and white bodies still persists. And then he said, how would American medicine, if it was truly scientific, deal with that issue? Well, he says one of the things American medicine would do is find out. We would do the studies where physicians are asked, do you have any beliefs about white and black physiologic differences? And you could ask those questions and people say, no, I don't have any such beliefs. But then you ask another question and you ask another question. If you do it the right way, eventually you kind of get at the truth. People know how to do those kinds of studies. And Hoberman argues in his book, those studies have simply not been done. American medicine doesn't want to know the answer to those questions. And that, he says, is a substantial failure of American medicine as science, not wanting to know the answer. So in that way, if the Hoberman thesis is correct, and the point is that even if his thesis is dead wrong, even if we did the research and we found out that none of those beliefs exist anymore in our society and in medicine, he still is correct, I think, about us not wanting to know, us not wanting to face it. So in that regard, some things that were true in 1951 in the days of Henrietta Lacks are probably not that different today.
I will confess to my mentor and all of you that I've only read about half of this book, and a lot of the research that I'm involved in concerns research about genetics. And so for me, as I read that book, thinking about, there's a lot of science happening right now that is trying to understand, is it true that there are racially based biological differences? And there are areas where, for example, in drug response, different people, I mean, you know this just from regular life, different people may respond differently to the same medication. There's some evidence that for some medications, that's a genetic reality, that there's something in the way that the genes are encoding proteins that makes individuals respond differently. And that in some cases, this may have some, and depending on how careful the researcher is, they may talk about it as race, or they may talk about it as ancestry. Ancestry is sort of the polite way. I mean, I think there's a lot in this book about how the languaging, I'm assuming everybody here is kind of a book person, a word person. The way that we language some of these issues matters a lot. So that one of the things he talks about is it's not overt racism. Well, what does that mean exactly? It's covert racism, and that kind's okay? Is that what it means? So there are, science, I think part of what he's pointing out in that book is science has a way of speaking to itself that tends to hide things that make the people doing the work uncomfortable and make certain kinds of questions inaccessible. And I think that, for me, that so far has been one of the very most interesting things, because in the area of genetics, even the way people speak and write about different populations of people and what those groupings mean, how we use race as a category in medicine and in society more generally, as a catch-all for socioeconomic status, education, all of these other things that we know have effects on people's health behavior, people's values around health. I think this is a really provocative set of ideas, and it'll be interesting to see. I wonder if you have an opinion about how it will, it's still pretty new, I think,
It's
how
still
it will
pretty
be
new.
received.
I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see what uptake this gets or does not get in the medical journals and medical schools, and to see what happens with this, because I believe it really is a very significant challenge to the way we do business today.
I wonder too what you think about, so in medical education there's been a trend over the past, I'm going to say maybe 10 years, toward cultural competence. We need to train new physicians and other clinicians in being culturally competent, which means sensitive and aware of cultural differences in the patient population that you serve. The term cultural competence sort of sets my teeth on edge, because I now know about you, right? So I am competent in you, which is, if we're looking for more relationality between clinicians and patients, saying, I know about you is maybe not the best starting place for that, but I wonder whether that is, if you have any thoughts about how that interacts with some of the ideas that are here.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really serious issue. That there's got, I think it's important to say there's a good side to what gets called cultural competency, simply because it helps a medical student who otherwise is not aware of this to simply be told, you know, there are folks out there who see the world in very different ways from how you see the world. And for example, I wouldn't necessarily imagine, if somebody hadn't told me, that there are societies where if I do the American thing, which is if I respect you, I look you right in the eye, that in that society that is a sign of profound disrespect. And looking somebody in the eye means something very, very negative. That would not have occurred to me. So some things need to be presented to people. Having said that, an awful lot of what passes for cultural competency training, I totally agree with you, turns very quickly into cultural stereotyping. We validate stereotypes. Oh, patients, African Americans, they're like this. Well, that's exactly the problem we're trying to get away from. Asians, they're like this, you know. And so if we could change somehow cultural competency to cultural humility and cultural curiosity, then many of my colleagues who teach this the right way would be a lot happier. But it's taking a while in medical school. Medical students, unfortunately, are so assaulted with information and are so petrified of the exam. And the going phrase in medical school is trying to learn the medical school curriculum is like trying to drink from a fire hose. And so they truly are pressured, and they are always paralyzed by what's going to be on the test. And so medical students become facilitators of a curriculum that says, just give me the answer, just tell me what's going to be on the test. And we really do have to back away from that and say, no, no, no. Just because a person is from a cultural group, that cultural group can have as much variation within the cultural group as between that group and any other group. If you don't go in with a sense of curiosity and an ability to ask certain questions to find out what these people believe and how these people behave, get them to help you understand their cultural life, their social life, you're not going to succeed just because I hand you a sheet of stereotypes and say this is what those people are like. So yes, we have made some advance in the sense that somebody has labeled culture as something medical students need to know about, along with the 600 other things they need to know about. But in terms of how we present it, I share your fear that we're not doing it the right way yet. So what are your thoughts on the biobanking issue? Do you have a sense about where we should be going in the future in terms of, do people have rights to cells that are removed from them?
Well, I think so a good starting place would be for us to get smarter about the regulations around this, because so Henrietta Lacks, if we look at that story, the way the law stands in this country now, if I go in and I have a biopsy as a clinical procedure, and there's leftover tissue from that procedure, most likely when I came into the healthcare facility, I signed a form, the consent to treat, that had a little line in it that said, anything you leave here is ours. Right? Like really, like a line like this. And if you're sick, the odds that you notice that or that it means anything to you are pretty slim. That's what in most institutions passes for consent for research use of tissue that is clinically collected. Now, by contrast, if I'm in a research study and I sign up, Howard says, hey Sue, we're doing this great study, will you be in the study? Here's what we want to do, here's what we'll ask you to do, here are all the different procedures that are involved. And I say yes, then I sign on the dotted line and I know what I'm signing up for. Howard has to tell me all of that and I have to agree to it specifically. So those two scenarios, it could be the same lump of tissue, right? Mm-hmm. But the way that it gets handled legally is very, very different depending on whether my treating physician is the one who collected it or a member of a research team collected it. So this is very confusing to a lot of people and kind of a goofy inconsistency in the way that we have the law set up right now. So that would be the first thing. I think the issue of whether people have an interest in tissue, my day job is talking to people about what they think about these questions. And people feel, many people are altruistic. Many people would say, well, geez, I wasn't going to do anything with it. I mean, if it can help someone, great. But they want to be asked, right? So there was this I was involved in a study where we had an ongoing study that involved genetic research, and we wanted to use those same samples. The consent that people signed for the original study said, we want to study diseases associated with aging. Well, that's pretty much all of them, right? So in terms of, if you were a lawyer reading that consent, you would say, well, gosh, that's a very broad consent. I guess it's okay. The IRB said, if you're going to share that data or those tissues with other people, we don't know what that will mean, and we think you have to go back and ask people if that's okay. We did that, and 98% of the people in the original study said, yes, that's okay with me. And at that point, this was a very important question to NIH, to the National Institutes of Health, because there are a lot of researchers who would like to say, well, geez, if everybody thinks it's okay, you don't have to ask. So we were awarded a small research supplement to go and ask those people who had said, yes, this is okay, would it have been all right if we did what we wanted to do and we didn't talk to you about it? And 90+% said no. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can do it, but you have to talk to me about it. And that disconnect is something that the research community is not real happy about. Because right now, we don't budget for this sort of procedure. The presumption is it's tissue. The other big thing that has changed is DNA. We didn't used to be as good at re-identifying people. In the old days, you could take people's names off the sample, take the date of birth off the sample, and it's just some cells. We don't know who it came from. Genetics says, that's me. It's only me. Even if I have a twin, it's just me, right? It's that specific. And so this business of protecting people solely by taking their identification off those tissues or those data doesn't cut it anymore. And that's something that I think the research community has got to get a better handle on. There are people who want to say that there's a duty to participate in research, that as citizens, all of us have an obligation to take part in research. My own sense about that is when we all benefit from research, that will be great. And that argument will hold up when everybody benefits. But until that time, you don't get to make that argument. So that was
Yeah.
long, but.
One of the ways I would characterize what Sue has been talking about and really providing some excellent information about the realities of when you do talk to people, what they say, is that it's very easy for the scientific community to fall into a trap of knowing that what they do is good, knowing that everybody values scientific advance, knowing that none of us today would want to go to a doctor who treated you with 1950s medicine instead of with today's recent discoveries. No. How many people here, anybody want to go to a 1950s? So that takes care of that, right? So knowing that science is good and knowing that scientists who do science are God's chosen people, they view any interference with their work, anything that slows them down even by 5 minutes or anything that costs them an extra penny, as intolerable interference with scientific progress. Okay? What Sue, I think, has been reflecting is scientists, how easily scientists could forget that the whole enterprise of science depends totally, completely on public trust. And that today, there was a time when a scientist could go into their back room in their manor house as an independent gentleman, just like Benjamin Franklin could fly a kite and check on lightning. He didn't need a federal grant to buy the kite or any of that. He just could do it on his own. And science was sort of a gentleman's hobby. Even then, you needed public trust, because you know those scenes in the Frankenstein movies where the peasants get their pitchforks and their torches and they're about to burn your house down if they think what you're doing isn't right. So even in those days, science depended on public trust. But today, when we're asking the public to fork over huge sums of money to pay for science, it particularly depends on public trust. And to fail to do what's required to build that trust and maintain that trust, I think is a very dicey approach to doing science. And one of the things that I think we've been talking about in all these sessions in one way or another is the lessons from the Henrietta Lacks case of how distrust can be sowed, how distrust can become concentrated in social groups and cultural groups who have particularly been victimized in the past and remember that victimization, and how long it then takes to rebuild trust once trust has been destroyed. And that I would like to see policies regarding tissues and biobanking that they're not just simply how do we get the science done, but they're also about how do we be sure that public trust is not threatened.
Yeah, I have a colleague who makes a distinction between, because very often, even again, the way we talk about this, they don't trust us. The problem is they don't trust us. Actually, the problem is we have proven ourselves to be untrustworthy. And that's a really different picture when you come around the table to the other side of that. Very different if the question is, how do we behave in a trustworthy way? Rather than how do we snow these people into letting us do what we want to do? Because we're, again, to Howard's point, we're so convinced that this is really what's best for you people out there.
Yeah. In the Henrietta Lacks book, and I'm hoping some of you will start joining the conversation very soon, please jump in when you want to. In the Henrietta Lacks book, there's, I think, many moving passages, but one of the passages that I found very moving was when the scientist at Hopkins, whose name I'm blocking on, the gentleman, I think, who was the one who invited the Lacks family to come into his laboratory, and he showed them the HeLa cells under the microscope, and he showed them photographs, and somebody finally sat and explained to this family, this is your mother's cells, this is what they do, this is what we do with them, this is why they're so important, this is why her legacy is so important in science. And what I think was very significant about that is you can read this book about these folks and where they came from, their minuscule level of education, the various cultural beliefs that they had based on where they grew up and what they were told when they were growing up. And you would say, there's no way these people could understand. There's no way. And you know, that when they were told in the 1970s, 20 years after Henrietta died, somewhere at Hopkins your mother's cells are still living. I mean, how could they possibly make sense of that? Your mother's dead, but her cells are still alive at Hopkins. What? I mean, but the point was when somebody took the time and the effort, they got it. people can get it if science would speak to them, if science would honor them with respect and say, you folks have some level of intelligence. If we could get off our high horse and explain it to you in everyday language and not in some kind of weird jargon language that we speak among ourselves, you will get it, you will understand. And we need to talk to you in that language so that everybody can be partners in this enterprise. It's not us doing things to you, it's us all moving forward together because we're partners, because we have this mutual respect.
So you talked about a time when everybody would get the benefit of research. Do you mean financially, or do you mean access to treatment that research gives us?
Yeah, I actually meant access. Right now, I mean, the Lacks story is a great example, right? I mean, you have this family whose forebear has led to so many scientific advantages and advances over time that you can't even, I think probably it's true to say you can't count them now. And they don't have health insurance. If you make an argument about the common good, it's an empirical question of whether, in fact, everyone does benefit. We talk a lot, I mean, I'm not going to, you can make your guesses, I'm not going to get up here and have a debate about it being an election year, but we are hearing a lot about the common good. And that always, there are a lot of people, don't let people just say it's for the common good. There's an empirical question about whether that is actually borne out in society. When we say it's for the good of everyone, the next question has to be, show me how that works, right? And I think right now, especially in health research, I'm most familiar right now with genetics research. And because of how genetics research works, the very populations that are most interesting to geneticists are the very people who are the worst off in this country. And so to say to, I mean, indigenous populations, Native American populations are the most over-researched population in the country. And it's a tiny little group of people. There's a lot of research money being thrown at those populations, and when you look at health rankings on pretty much any measure you want to consider, it's abysmal. So how is that research for the common good, right? How can we turn to people who are in that sort of life situation and say, you owe it to the rest of us to be in this study, because it's for the good of everybody. So that was really where I was headed, was sort of with the more general justice question. But I think the economic question is interesting too.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is probably important to highlight is that I'm sure all of you are nice people, and I'm sure all of you have really wonderful cells in your body. But it's probably the case that none of us in this room have a cell line in our bodies, growing in our bodies somewhere, that is going to make somebody a ton of money. And so there's something a little bit strange about focusing on the two cases that are mentioned in the book, the HeLa cell case and the John Moore case from California, where a gentleman had a weird tumor of his spleen, a very unusual kind of tumor, and it turned out that these cells were just really important, and the scientist who harvested the cells made a ton of money, which John Moore didn't see a penny of. And that's very, very, very rare. So on the one hand, it's hard, you know, they say hard cases make bad law in the legal area. Unusual cases sometimes make bad ethics when we focus on what happens very rarely and not on what happens commonly. But on the other hand, one of those cases, as it gets known about, is exactly the seed of that distrust that we were talking about earlier, which could have ripple effects well beyond that one individual case.
I've been sitting here thinking that Sue was talking about the difference between the tissue that I give to that I sign on the line and say, here surgeon, you can have my tissue, and the type of research that you are talking about, that I'm assuming that the grants that you receive for your research are government rather than private. They're not from pharmaceutical companies or people who make money off of the research and the information that you that you, the conclusions of your research, is that true? I'm trying to think of why.
That's a very, very important question. If you are undergoing some kind of surgery and a sample of cells is taken from your body as part of that surgery, most of the time the purpose of that is very simple. That's for your treatment.
Right.
The surgeon needs to know something about those cells to guide your further treatment, and the pathologist in the laboratory is looking at those cells under a microscope, doing some special stain, and it's all aimed at your treatment. No, and the usual outcome is those cells are then thrown away.
Right.
Maybe somebody saves a slide, but the cells get thrown away. That's the usual outcome. So nobody makes any money, and nobody does any research on that. That's just strictly for your treatment only. Okay? Rarely there will be something about those cells, or the fact that those cells are being gathered at a time when somebody's doing a special study in that region, where a piece of those cells will end up being part of a research study, and then if you didn't look carefully at the form you signed, you said, that's okay, I'm giving my permission. Okay? Now, let's turn that around though, and let's look at medical research generally and who pays for medical research.
Right, that's my.
In our country, a lot of medical research is paid for by the federal government and by some private foundations, but a lot of medical research is paid for by for-profit folks who are in this for their money. Okay? And if it was a procedure that involved surgery, it's very unlikely that this would be something that would be a for-profit thing for a pharmaceutical
Right.
company. It could be related, though, to a medical device company where they're trying to develop a new device for part of your surgery, like if you're getting, say, a hip replacement, where they're putting something in your body that's a very pricey piece of equipment. Check out what it costs to buy that new hip that you got put in. Those studies are unfortunately done by the company. The company views the results of the study as their proprietary property, and they want the results of those studies not to be scientifically pure. They want the results of those studies to sell their product.
So we're looking at private industry versus
Right.
that has
And if
less
you,
restriction and less lawful consent,
yeah.
and the public where if this tissue goes one other place, it needs another consent. So there are more restrictions from,
Well, the same basic rules for research get followed in terms of having to go through a research review board, having to get informed consent. Here's the piece of it, though, that I worry about. The piece of consent that I think is really essential for many pharmaceutical or device-related studies would be to tell you, you know, from a scientific point of view, this study is kind of second-rate. And if you're allowing your body to be used for this study, you need to know that it's more for the marketing interest of the company than it is for some scientific advance.
and that is
And
not
I
in
believe
place.
that, and that's not in the typical consent form. Now you, if you sign up for a study thinking that you're advancing science, when in actual fact you're advancing the marketing position of a company, you deserve to know that, and maybe you should say, I want my cut. You guys are gonna make billions of dollars off this new drug, I want my cut if I'm gonna use my body for your marketing, okay? To me, that's perfectly logical, that you would want that. If it's for science, that's a whole different story, right? If the whole purpose of the study was let's advance scientific, but there's been case after case after case revealed in the work that I've done with ethics in the pharmaceutical industry, I regret to say, studies that are published in scientific journals as if they are real scientific breakthroughs, when you read the internal memos of the company, you see that it's really jiggered around much more for marketing than it is for science. So I wish I could tell you that it's all totally, completely on the up and up, it's all totally open, and you know what you're getting into. But if there has been commercial funding for the study, there's at least a possibility that you may not be getting the full information in the typical consent form about what purpose this is being done for.
Which can therefore erode the public trust that you're
Absolutely,
talking about.
and that's very, very worrisome to me.
Will
Now, I
that be
think there was
held
a
up
hand
under
up.
law?
Pardon?
Would that be held up under the law if you said, I want my take from this? Because all the lawsuits in this book were turned down.
It's,
Well, there's the Ted Slavin case, which is in the, I think she talks about in the appendix, and that's someone who knew up front, he was hemophiliac, and he knew up front that he had a compound, I think, in his blood that was sort of scientifically interesting, and he negotiated up front, sure, I'll share this because I want to help other hemophiliacs, and if you want to develop drugs that will help with that, then sure, and I want my cut. And so it depends. That the problem comes that most people don't have, as Howard's saying, the information they would need to say, hey, wait a second, because it's not in the pharmaceutical companies or whoever's interest to tell you that, right? So it's a little bit of a catch-22, and I think asking questions before you sign these things, I mean, I know it's, it's like closing on a mortgage or something. It's a lot of paper, but asking exactly what is being done, and because that is a legal requirement that your questions be answered.
If I could move the subject on, I'd like to ask you a question, which is something which I've seen from my experience in industry, and reflecting your statement about the African American community and prejudice perhaps against them. One of the things that's very curious to us who've worked in the industry and done clinical trials is how difficult it is to get African Americans to actually participate in clinical trials. And I wonder if you have thoughts on why that is.
Do you have any research data on that?
Because we've been untrustworthy. I mean, I think, that's kind of a smart alecky answer, but there are, and it's actually something that's talked about in the book Howard was referencing as well. There is a long history of people who were considered less than upper-class, white, well-educated people who were misused as research subjects. Whether those were African-American people, whether those were Native American people, whether those were prisoners, whether those were people with mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities. We have a pretty bad track record on all of that. The history of medical research among African-American people, a lot of people, I think that it started with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. That's a very late event in an ongoing pattern of abuse of African-American patients in research. And people know that. I mean, when you read this book and they talk about, don't go in Johns Hopkins, you don't know if you'll get out. That's people aren't joking about that. The idea that even going when you're going for medical care, not that you're signing up for a research study, but you're sick, and you don't trust what they're going to do. People here probably, I mean, we're all of an age to remember. There still is a belief that the United States government was purposely infecting African American people with HIV. Right? I mean, that was one of the big barriers to HIV treatment in African American communities. So there is, it's not out of nowhere, I guess I would say.
Wait a minute.
One of the points you made about research studies is they tend to focus on fairly homogeneous, tightly formed groups of people, and that they are very often economically, socially disadvantaged. To what extent are researchers who are going to these marginalized communities, can they be said to be exploiting the vulnerability, the absence of access in those communities to begin with? This community hasn't had a team of doctors come in, they want samples. This is going to make our lives better. And the researchers come in, they spend their 18 months in this place, and then it's see you later. To what extent are researchers really just exploiting the people they harvest data from?
Well, where I think that really comes to the fore most prominently is research that is currently being done internationally. There's a little less likelihood that that's going to happen. It still could happen easily in the U.S. in all the settings you have, but it's particularly a problem in international research. And one of the things that's happened, and again,
who's funding the international research?
I'm sorry?
Are these the pharmaceutical companies? Are
These
these
are both.
universities going to Africa and conducting studies?
These are both. These are both. It turns out that, again, I don't mean to further abuse the pharmaceutical industry, just to pick on the pharmaceutical industry, but there's advantages from a financial point of view to taking studies that used to be done here in the US and shipping them overseas to poorer countries for a variety of reasons. One of which is that one of the things you like to do is you like to get people who are not already on a bunch of drugs if you're going to test a new drug. And we in America have been so successfully marketed to, if I may say that a lot of us are on a lot of drugs. And so it's harder to find people here who are good research subjects. And when you go to a resource-poor country and you're going to do a study, one of the things that makes it very attractive that they're likely to welcome you with open arms is, number one, there's no kind of training going on in that country for potential future researchers. And if they can jump on board with their local medical school and their local folks, they can get some experience with research that otherwise would be totally unavailable. And in addition, as you pointed out, for a brief period of time, they might be able to get more care because of the intensity of the resources that are suddenly show up when they're doing a study. Now, some have argued that the only circumstances under which that kind of research is ethically acceptable is, number one, the disease or the condition being studied should be a real problem in the health of that population. So to test our latest cholesterol drug over in Africa and then bringing the benefits back so we could have lower cholesterol in the US is not consistent with that. But if you're going to go study river blindness in Sudan, then that makes sense. Okay? And then the other argument that some have made, I don't know if it, frankly, I would totally support it, but just to highlight the point you're making is, if you don't leave some kind of resource behind that's sustainable to help the community that has contributed to the research, the argument is that research is unethical and should not be done in that setting.
How long has that been a viewpoint in that you really should leave something permanent?
Well, that's an argument. I'm not saying it's one, but I'm saying that's an argument.
Right,
And I've seen that kind of argument maybe for, what, about 10 years now, people making that argument. But the point is, the concern about exploitation is a concern that is increasingly showing up in the literature I'm reading about the ethics of research on human subjects, and particularly in vulnerable populations. So it's at least getting some attention. In no way, shape, or form am I saying it's been resolved. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my cell phone number. I think I'm starting to know how to work this darn thing. So answer when you call. And here's when I want you to call me. I want you to watch the TV news, your favorite station, every night. And probably just most nights you're going to hear some science news or medical news. There's a little blip, 2 or 3 minutes. And as soon as you hear a story where somebody says there's this brand new discovery just out and we're worried that this could cause more harm than good. So therefore, we're going to suggest that we go slow with this and not be too rapid. I want you to call me. Okay? I am not going to lose much sleep with you. All right? This is our social, cultural thing, about, as Susan just said, about technology. There are a lot of examples on both sides. There are a lot of examples of really good things where the people commonly quote, I think it was either 12 or 17 years I hear, the average period of time it takes for a really good new discovery to actually get disseminated and doctors start using it. Okay? The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has got a big program going right now which they call translational science. And what this is all about is how do we speed up that process of getting good discoveries out of the laboratory into the community and into people's health care. All right? For every anecdote I can tell you about one of those studies, those things that's really good for you, and it took 12 or 17 years to get out there where we were benefiting from it, I can tell you another technology that got snapped up, everybody started getting it, and only 5 or 10 or 15 years later did somebody do the definitive research that said, this is bad for you, we shouldn't be doing this. There's both kinds of examples out there, okay? So we either need better ways to be sober about new technology, not drink the Kool-Aid, but say, let's take a few more years, let's really study this before we start disseminating it. And then a faster way to get it out there if it's really good, and a way to say no if it's really bad. Okay? Or we need a better learning system that corrects as we go, but that does a better job at it than what we got today. But what we got today in the US tends to be this love affair with new technology, just as Sue described. and not a sober, careful assessment. And there are a lot of people who will jump up and scream if you seem like you're getting in between them and the latest, whatever it is. And that's the government getting between you and your doctor and death panels and so forth and so forth, okay? And unfortunately, folks like, I'll say, medical device companies can use that as a way to ward off more government regulation, because they could use those fears that somebody will deprive you of the latest technology as a lobbying tool and then ward off interference with their ability to potentially market unsafe devices. I say that for devices particularly because just this past couple of years there's been a very intensive lobbying effort by the medical device industry to ward off more FDA regulation, despite really good evidence that there's unsafe devices that are not being adequately tested before they're being put in people. And so Congress has been willing to hear the device lobbyists say, look at all the jobs that'll go overseas if they regulate us too much here in the US, rather than, hey, Americans could die because they're getting unsafe medical devices.
I'm just a little curious, if the African Americans were considered kind of lesser than, why did they jump all over her cells, a poor, black, uneducated woman? And is it just because they grew, and did they, was there never a time that they thought, well, gee, you know, I wonder if it's just...
I don't think, and nothing that I've read was that even something that Dr. Guy was concerned about. They were so desperate to get cells to stay alive in culture.
Right.
And these cells not only stayed alive in culture, but grew
Just
like
flourished, yeah.
crazy. I mean, grew so crazily that there's now a big problem with contamination because they get into everything and they take other cultures over. I think it was just the straight up biology that they were like magic.
And so they even kind of forgot what color she was.
Well, and most people didn't know, right? Because
Right.
at the time that that
Oh, that's right,
original
'cause they were
research
just
was
giving
done,
it
that would be
away.
through genetics, right? That you would
Yeah.
be able to say, there are markers here that we see in people who are descended from the African continent. That was when they first began to realize that these cells had in fact made it out into places that they didn't think they were, where they shouldn't have been. You know, if you have a prostate cancer sample that has XX and XY in it, that's a problem. Because women don't get prostate cancer.
I don't remember the exact circumstance, but I do remember that in the course of the training I received as an undergraduate in the biochemistry program, and then going on in the medical school, I was taught at some point along the way about tissue culture. And when I was taught about tissue culture, I was taught about HeLa cells, and these really, really important cells that they did all these experiments on. And I was told, as best as I can recollect, that the name HeLa came from the name of the person who gave the cells, and that person was named Helen Lane.
Right.
And that's where the cells came from. And there was nothing ever said that I recall ever hearing at all about whether this was a person of any race.
Is it,
Or
so the
it
name got
was just
changed
named-
after a
Yeah,
number
so-
of years.
So the point is that for very quickly after the cells originally started growing, everything about the origin of the cells were completely forgotten by the vast majority of people. And it was some of the really important detective work of Rebecca Skloot that she was able to go back and tell the story that she told, because all of that was totally hidden for the most part by the time that this book was written.
So I wish I had read this, well, sooner, but I read this book a long time ago, and it was called Who Goes First? The Story of Self-Experimentation in Medicine. And the point is that at some point, okay, they do things on tissues, and they do things on animals, but at some point, a human being has to try something. And in this book, as I recall, very often the doctor or the inventor or the researcher was the one who finally said, okay, I'm going to try this. But so my question to you is really, who does go first? I mean, at some point, someone has to try the pill. Or so how do we decide?
Okay, well, let me say a couple of things, and I certainly want to hear what Sue has to say. One thing I would say is there is an interesting tradition but I don't think it's much honored today. But there is a long, long, very respectable tradition of self-experimentation where investigators said exactly that. If I'm going to do this to anybody else, I should do it to myself first. The fellow who invented the cardiac, what's today the cardiac cath, the ability to put a catheter into your vein and thread it all the way to your heart and take pictures of your heart, did it to himself first, and then walked up a flight of stairs to go to the next level where there was an x-ray machine so he could take an x-ray and show that this was actually his heart. Okay, that was Werner Forsman, I believe his name was. All right, so there is
As I
this.
recall, he started through a testicle. Because I read that story, yes, he did. Didn't stick with it.
So anyway, yeah, so there is that tradition that I don't think, and again, the research requirements today would make that relatively more difficult. I'm not sure I would get through the IRB, to be honest. But at any rate, but then, okay, so that's one thing. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is how many people die of being in a medical experiment? How many people have really serious health catastrophes as a result of being in a medical experiment? The simple fact is, medical experimentation today, medical research today is quite safe. It does happen that bad things happen, and when that happens, it's a huge scandal, a huge crisis, because it's so rare. So the fact of the matter is, the idea that we're putting people at risk by saying you're going to be the first one to get it, by the time you've done all the preparatory studies that are required, you have relatively an awful lot of prediction about what's going to happen in the human body. And so your ability to plan an experiment in a way that's reasonably safe, reasonably predictable, in the vast majority of cases is very high. So I do think we have to not get too off track in terms of thinking there's a huge risk, because statistically it's just simply not there. And it doesn't mean that it isn't a big deal. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be very respectful of the rights of the human subject, but it does mean that if you just look at the statistics, medical research is actually quite safe.
So let me ask you one other question then. I'm just going to assume that someone did have a cell, like that one man had I think he had hairy cell leukemia, right? And his cells were very of interest.
Yeah.
To me, he does have some, well, I won't say obligation, but if he just said, no, you cannot use my cells, I would feel very funny about that, okay? And to a certain extent, I do think my cells belong to me, but they don't belong to me in the sense that I invented them. I mean, they just accidentally belong to me. And you know what I mean.
You're attached to them, though.
Yes, I am attached to them, but I haven't, it's not like I invented something incredible. It's just by happenstance. So let me just turn it around and ask, what do you think someone's obligations are to say yes to an
So this is an interesting
something
question.
like that?
This is a really interesting question. So I think that one distinction that we might make is, would I say a person ought to do that? I probably would. Would I say that society has a right to compel him to do that? No. Right? Which is maybe a too philosophically hair-splitting a point.
Yeah.
But I think to say the right thing for a person to do in that situation would be to share that resource for the benefit of other people.
Yeah.
But can we force that on someone? I would say no. I would say no. And not only because, I mean, the most obvious reason that I would say that is the slippery slope of that sort of argument is terrible, right? You have stuff we want, we're going to take it. We don't like that idea very much. But I think that the difference between a should that is a weaker should and a straight duty or an obligation to society, for me, there's a dividing line between those two things.
I just want to follow up on that point real quick with a question. If we're going to respect the bodily integrity, but if it gets to a point where it's real easy to get something from somebody and replicate it, wouldn't it then, the stronger argument that all we need is one of your hair or something like that.
Sure.
And then the argument would be stronger, listen, you can't keep that, you really shouldn't keep that, we're gonna take your hair. I mean,
Yeah. Taking your hair, it sounds a lot better than Monty Python's "We've come for your liver."
right.
But again, I don't want to turn this into a legal discussion, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not competent, okay? But where does informed consent come from in the first place? Why do we have this doctrine of informed consent? In one way or another, an awful lot of what we're talking about all evening here is predicated on the idea of informed consent, that what it means to respect you is to not do something to you without telling you first and getting your say-so, okay? Informed consent is based on a legal doctrine, at least in part on a legal doctrine that says your body is well nigh inviolable in law. And again, we could chastise you as a bad person, as an ungenerous person, as a selfish person, as an unimaginative person, if you refuse to give up a part of your body that could have wonderful effects on others and that you wouldn't miss at all. Okay? But the law says you have no right to invade that person's body to get it, no matter how huge the benefit to the rest of society. So if we gave up that legal principle of the inviolability of the body, we have to realize we're also giving up part of the foundation on which informed consent is constructed. So okay, your hand was up, but this gentleman over here had a hand up before, so did you want? Yeah.
No, I just wanted to, I should, I'm actually on the same IRB as Sue, so I'm an insider of sorts. By the time you get to human testing of drugs, for example, it's already gone through a long series of tests. And then there are 3 phases of human testing. The first one is a very small number of people. So by the time it gets to the larger population, it's gone through a ton of testing. So I think that's important to point out.
Thank you.
Before you get to human trials, often we have animal trials. Have you had any discussion with the PETA people about the ethics of using animals for scientific purposes?
I haven't.
Okay. We do a course.
The reason I say that, I taught at the medical school at the University of Illinois, and they would pick at us and say, this is unethical that we are taking these animals who are innocent and subjecting them to various tests and who knows, and killing them to find out a result.
Yeah, we teach a course at our place that is an ethics of scientific research course. And it's a course that we do because it's compliant with National Institutes of Health requirements. All our grad students and all our postdoc fellows have to take this course. So we have developed this in a way that for some years now we have included a panel on research animal protection and research animal interest in issues in the course. So we usually get a pretty interesting discussion going, because on the one hand you have PETA, who want to sort of use any experimentation on any animal. Let me put it this way, any nice animal. If we did a lot of experiments on cockroaches, they apparently wouldn't give a hoot. But if it's doggies or kitties or something, that people care about, nice mammals, furry mammals, they really get upset. And that's on one extreme. On the other extreme, we still have maybe a few scientists who just cannot see any, again, science is pure, science is wonderful, science is good. How can you do anything that could possibly stand in the way of science? Okay? The middle ground is right now very well developed. The middle ground is there's some really, really good, I think, standards developed for protection of laboratory animals that are based on the idea that you can use laboratory animals and their interests have to be looked after. They need humane care, pain should be prevented, you should use fewer animals rather than more animals. If you can do it on mice, you shouldn't do it in monkeys. There's a whole bunch of rules, a whole bunch of regulations that are now very, very carefully looked at. Our place lost its standard of accreditation and had to work and regain it because somebody was messing up in one of the animal laboratories where somebody was going in and doing something without the proper training for doing that particular procedure. So it was a relatively technical point, but we lost accreditation. 2 vets got fired, and a whole, big flap occurred, and 2 or 3 years later, we scrambled and we got the accreditation back again. That was a big deal at our place. That was we had lost that seal of approval that we were taking good care of our animals. Okay, so I think today, the PETA, the best answer to PETA is if people would be told the truth about what is actually happening in the care of laboratory animals in scientific facilities. I think the truth is very, very, very reassuring to people who care about animals, that they are not being mistreated, and that this is done very, very carefully and very cautiously. And I think I wish that story was better told. And you can understand why people don't tell the stories, because PETA could be picketing in your front yard. If you're a scientist and you went on the radio and said that, or the TV, the next thing you know, PETA could be trying to burn your house down. So it is really unfortunate that there's this extreme group that has pushed the debate in that direction.
From what I understand too, there's a lot more work happening now with simulation models to keep as much work
Right.
out of animal systems even as possible.
Right.
One of your early comments was that there is still a lot of research being done on Native Americans. Why? And for what purpose? I mean,
Gosh, well, for all the reasons we do research. One thing is that there are health differences, what Howard was talking about earlier as disparities,
right?
that are different in those groups than in others, and we don't, I would say my own bias about this is we've described the heck out of it. And what needs to happen with research now is intervention research to find out what will make it better. This is very much in line with sort of where we started, that we have a lot of descriptive work out there that says this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And my guess would be that many of the things that are discussed in this book about African American populations and medicine apply right down the line in Native American and other indigenous groups. Research is being done there partly because we need to understand what works, not more descriptive, this is a terrible problem stuff, but what would help. Some of the interventions that work, particularly behavioral things, are going to be different, right? The way that we live on Bainbridge Island is quite different from the way people live on a reservation in a lot of ways. And so the kinds of things you might do here to help someone quit smoking, for example, going to be very, very, very different. And we're not good at that yet, because it still is that most of the people, one of the other issues that comes up here and elsewhere is that still most of the people doing the medicine are white. We're starting to have more representation in the medical profession and in the clinical professions and in science more generally. But still, it's mostly white people. It's mostly people who are not the first in their family to go to college. So trying also to get the pipeline of, within those communities, people talk about it as growing our own, where we figure out what the research priorities are for ourselves and we do the work. So that piece of sort of research capacity building is another relatively new trend in that kind of work.
Well, I want to thank all of you.
so much.
Thank you.
Great questions, great.